Here's a small handful of facts that Christians either don't know or don't want you to know. Concerning the composition and internal anonymity of the Gospels. The text of the four canonical Gospels contains internal data regarding authorship and relationship that contradicts the traditional narrative of the four independent eyewitness accounts. Internal anonymity. None of the four Gospels contain a signature or an internal claim by the writer stating their name. For example, Matthew didn't say, "I, Matthew, saw this or wrote this." The titles, according to Matthew, according to Mark, etc., were added by later church scribes in the 2nd century to establish authority. The Gospels are third-person narratives. The author of Matthew uniformly refers to Matthew, the tax collector, in the third person in Matthew 9:9. The "we" of John. The conclusion of the fourth Gospel explicitly distinguishes the author from the source, stating, "This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them, and we know that his testimony is true," John 21:24, indicating a group or community editing a tradition. Luke's prologue. The author of Luke explicitly states in his opening verses 1 through 4, that he is not an eyewitness. He notes that many have undertaken to compile a narrative and that he is investigating these past accounts to write an orderly narrative for an individual named Theophilus. And no one even knows who this Theophilus is or even when he lived. Literary dependency, the synoptic problem. The Gospels are not four completely independent streams of information. Textual analysis proves massive verbatim literary copying, verbatim Greek parallelism. Matthew, Mark, and Luke share identical Greek sentence structures, rare vocabulary, and grammatical quirks over entire paragraphs. Because oral tradition does not produce identical paragraphs of written Greek text across different authors, this proves direct literary copying. Markan priority. Approximately 80% of Mark's verses appear in Matthew, and about 65% appear in Luke. When Matthew and Luke alter Mark, they almost always do so to improve Mark's rough Greek grammar or to correct theological ambiguities, such as changing Mark's "he could do no miracle there" to "he did not do many miracles there." Direct contradictions in the text. When the Gospels are placed side by side, a synopsis, their chronologies, locations, and historical claims directly conflict. The genealogies of Matthew 1 versus Luke 3. From King David down to Joseph, the two lineages diverge almost completely. Matthew tracks the royal line through Solomon, while Luke tracks it through Nathan. They list entirely different grandfathers for Jesus, Jacob in Matthew, but Heli in Luke. The post-birth geography. In Matthew, Joseph and Mary live in a house in Bethlehem. They flee immediately to Egypt to escape Herod and only move to Nazareth later to avoid Herod's son. But in Luke, Joseph and Mary live in Nazareth, travel to Bethlehem briefly for a census, perform the temple purification rites in Jerusalem 40 days later, and go straight back home to Nazareth. There is no chronological room or mention of a flight to Egypt. The day of the crucifixion. In the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus eats the Passover meal with his disciples and is crucified on Passover Day. But in John, Jesus is crucified the day before Passover at the exact afternoon hour when the Passover lambs are being slaughtered in the temple. John 19:14. He does not eat a Passover meal. The resurrection appearances. Matthew states the disciples were told to go to Galilee to see Jesus, but Luke explicitly states Jesus told them not to leave Jerusalem in Luke 24:49, and that all appearances happened in the Jerusalem area. Epistolary pseudepigraphy and historical records. The study of the Pauline epistles and contemporary first-century secular history reveals significant gaps in the traditional narrative. Pseudepigraphy means false authorship. Textual linguistics, word counts, sentence structure, stylistic metrics, and theological shifts have led to a firm academic consensus that of the 13 letters attributed to Paul, 6 of them can be ruled out as authored by Paul. I personally dispute that Paul wrote any letter that is in the Bible. The 6 that scholars have already ruled out are Ephesians, Colossians, 2 Thessalonians, 1 and 2 Timothy, and Titus, because they show distinct vocabulary and grammatical patterns indicating they were written by different authors writing in Paul's name, a common practice in the Greco-Roman world known as pseudepigraphy. Total silence of secular historians on Paul. There is no surviving first-century secular Roman, or Jewish record of a man named Paul of Tarsus. The Josephus record. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, writing his extensive histories, Jewish Antiquities and the Jewish War, at the end of the 1st century, details numerous religious figures, revolutionaries, and Roman administrators in Judea, but never mentions Paul. The geopolitical and linguistic reality of the text. The cultural and political framework of the New Testament belongs to the Greco-Roman world, not ancient Israel. The Greek language. Jesus and his immediate disciples would have spoken Aramaic, a Semitic language. However, every single book of the New Testament was originally composed, structured, and rhetorically crafted in Koine Greek, the lingua franca of the Roman Empire's urban centers. The Roman state preservation. Christianity became the official state religion of the Roman Empire under the Edict of Thessalonica in 380 CE. For over a millennium following the fall of Rome, the reproduction, translation, and preservation of those texts were entirely controlled by the state-sanctioned church, which decided which texts were copied, which were labeled heretical and destroyed, and how variants in the manuscripts were managed. And finally, institutional bias in academic biblical studies. The sociological reality of biblical academia affects how data is presented to the public. Faith statements and confessions of faith. A significant percentage of colleges, seminaries, and universities teaching biblical studies require professors to sign a formal statement of faith or inerrancy clause as a condition of employment. These legal contracts state that the employee must agree beforehand that the Bible contains no errors or contradictions. Consequently, any scholar bound by these statements risks losing their career, tenure, and livelihood if their published research concludes that a text contains a factual error or a genuine historical contradiction. As bad as we hate to admit it, Christianity is built on a foundation of lies.